and Craig Smoke.
It was great to have Jackson Player, now Baylor defensive lineman, in studio. We're going to get to David Hellman here momentarily. Craig?
Yeah, just one thought I had while listening to Jackson was I would have loved to have been in the film room with Coach DJ, Coach Aranda, whoever else was in there, Ron Roberts, I'd imagine, and just have them pop on the tape and just be able to watch their reactions to like, oh, yeah, we want him. Oh, yeah, for sure. He's a fit here. I just would have loved to have been in there the moment they realized, like, yep, he's going to be an offer, and we're going to try to bring him back home. And they got him, and a big get, and glad to have Jackson here in studio.
It was fantastic to see him again. We're now joined by David Hellman, DallasCowboys.com. David, what's it like in Big D this week, today? What is it like, a death in the family? What's it like?
Well, my expertise is kind of limited. I spent the day at the facility, and I promise you that's a somber place. But yeah, just, reading the cues from social media and talk radio and the fan base, yeah, it's somewhere between like a funeral and an angry mob, as you would probably expect after you flame out of the playoffs in embarrassing fashion.
All right, David, what's the more important 14 that Cowboys should be focusing on? The 14 seconds in the play that they called at the end of the game, or the 14 penalties that they had?
Honestly, if you spend, and this is just my opinion, if you spend more than about a minute and a half worrying about the final 14 seconds of that game, I just don't take your opinion seriously. I mean, yeah, it was chaotic. The play call was questionable. The refereeing might have been questionable, but I mean, you had 59 other minutes to play a better football game. I mean, forget the first half. How about getting the ball with 2.5 minutes to play and all of your timeouts down 6? Yeah, how about 14 penalties, like half of which were pre-snap penalties? Yeah, I mean, when you just play that poorly across the board for the other 59 minutes, yeah, it's wild and unfortunate what happened in the last 30 seconds, but, like, I just don't care. It's not the reason why you lost.
No, it's not, and that's all I've seen today. It's like from the time that I looked at anything on television to even listening for a second to the fan when I was driving a couple of different places, it's all I've heard about. And it doesn't do justice to what San Francisco was able to do or some things Dallas was not able to do. David, what happened to the offensive line? Is that the number one focus they have to look at in the offseason?
It probably should be. Yeah. I mean, obviously there's going to be a number of things you've got to worry about. Defensively, we don't even know who this team's coordinators are going to be. But in terms of things that you can address, yeah, I absolutely think that was the number one thing that sank them yesterday that they can try to fix in the offseason. Tyron Smith, obviously hobbled by an ankle injury, didn't look like himself. He's a guy that's getting older. Between him and Lyle Collins, I think you've got to worry about the future of the position. I think they can both be solid starters next year, but it's clearly something you need to be worried about for the future. Connor Williams, maybe the worst game of his career, or if not the worst game of his career, then like the worst possible moment to play a bad game. Tyler Biadasz hasn't been awful this year, but certainly hasn't been a strength on this team. Teams have bullied them on the interior of the line, and Dak Prescott's a good quarterback. I genuinely still believe that. Yesterday doesn't change my opinion of what he's capable of doing, but what I will say is he's not a good enough quarterback to overcome poor offensive line play, and they got it far too often in the second half.
Yeah, David, I would think that a lot of people would throw out other positions for the Cowboys to focus on in the draft, maybe before offensive line, because the popular narrative is that their offensive line is so dominant. But I would say that moves right up the charts as to early on things you have to address when it comes to draft time. Yeah,
I mean, it's funny. I think the narrative on the Cowboys' offensive line being dominant is outdated by 4 or 5 years. And now I think you got to say the narrative of it being good is outdated by at least a year or two. And I mean, it's not awful. It's certainly not like, I mean, there are some really bad offensive lines in this league. But again, in terms of like being a strength of your team, it just isn't. And it hasn't been while they've been playing 500 football over the second half of this season. I mean, it's hard to predict, right? You got the best safety on this team is a free agent. One of your edge rushers is a free agent. A lot of wide receivers are becoming free agents. So, I mean, there is a bunch of stuff in flux. It's hard to say the day after the season what their biggest need is. But I agree with you in general that they need to throw some resources at shoring up the offensive line. Probably not just in the draft, but free agency as well.
David, one of the big topics I heard following that game were people talking about, listening to the post game and whatnot, the future of Mike McCarthy. I know that Stephen Jones had some comments today about being very confident that McCarthy will return. Just your thoughts on any debate about, his job status or whether or not you think he'd be back in Dallas next season.
I mean, on the surface, it sounds kind of crazy to me, honestly, that a guy, I mean, you go 12-5, you win the division in your second year. Your first year is kind of a wash because of all of the injuries and adversity you're facing. I will say, I understand the frustration. Just the sloppiness of that play and the fact that it was a recurring theme. I mean, how many games did we watch this team get penalized 10 or more times in a sloppy loss? I understand the frustration that they didn't seem to improve on any of their trouble spots. And I do agree with the idea that well, I don't know if you just want to roll the ball back out there and not change anything. And yeah, I mean, I think a lot of stuff is going to be in flux for this team. I mean, both of their coordinators are going to be interviewing for jobs all this week. The odds that obviously the roster's not going to come back the same, but it's a very good bet that the coaching staff won't either. But I think it's a little knee-jerky to call for McCarthy's job. But I don't blame people for being very disconcerted by how ugly that effort was yesterday.
David, Mike McCarthy, in fact, this is year 2 for him. Jerry always has said that I can remember that he always regretted not giving Chan Gailey more than 2 years. Do you think that comes into play at all, even though that was a long time ago?
Yeah, I do. And I mean, he did the same thing with Jason Garrett. It's funny, Jerry has this outside perception as being a knee-jerk kind of guy who's just going to willy-nilly make changes. But I think he was the same way with Jason Garrett. I think most people would say he probably held on to Garrett too long because he thought he was well, I'm putting in all this blood, sweat, and tears to develop Garrett into a guy who can get the job done. And then you go the other end of that, which is they held on too long. And then it's pretty obvious to me when Jerry was finally confronted with having to move on from Jason Garrett, he was like, okay, well, if I have to let go of Jason Garrett, I'm getting a coach in here who's been there and done that and has been through the wars, which, to bring it full circle, that's what makes this so ironic is, Mike McCarthy was brought here for those types of moments. He was brought here because the playoff spotlight wasn't going to be too bright for a guy who had been to a Super Bowl and made 4 NFC championship runs. And obviously there's always a lot more that goes into it than blaming one person. But I mean, he's the head coach. The buck stops with him, and they did not look like a team that was ready for a playoff game.
Would it shock you if Leighton Vander Esch wasn't back?
No, not at all. I thought he played a nice game yesterday. I thought he played one of his better games of the season. I think the Niners wanting to run so much and play physical football plays well to his skill set. But I didn't think he had the type of season that you need to make him a priority. I think obviously you've got Micah there. You've got Jabril Cox, who has been out for half the season, coming back for the second year of his rookie contract. And much like running back on the other side of the ball, that's just a position where I think you can find production with cheap rookie contracts and inexpensive veterans. I mean, if it works out to where you can bring Leighton back cheaply, that's fine. But it wouldn't shock me at all if both parties kind of say, yeah, let's go try something else.
David, I know you're not focused on the end of that game, and I'm not by any means trying to make it as some excuse either, but I'm just curious what your thoughts were. I mean, sitting there live and in action, watching that, knowing the circumstances, watching the clock. I mean, we talked about how we were all just staring at the TV like, what in the world's going on? But what was going through your head at that point?
It's funny. And that's, look, I get it. Our job is to provide not just an opinion, but like we want to be entertaining. And so that's how you wind up in this world where everything's either genius or stupid. And my thought process was literally, I was sitting in the press box and I was like, oh my God, he's gonna run. And then like as the play was developing, I was like, okay, I get it. I understand why they did this. They're trying to steal yards to get closer to the end zone. The Niners literally had stacked DBs on the sideline. Like they were not going to give up a sideline throw. They were begging Dallas to do something in the middle of the field. And they thought that they could steal 15 yards and give themselves an easier shot at the end zone. The problem is, and so like literally all of this is happening in my head. I'm like, okay, I get the logic. I understand what you're trying to do, but you are asking so many things to go right. Like the quarterback's got to get down at exactly the right moment. They've got to spot the ball correctly. The refs have to be ready for it. All of the players have to be ready for it. You can't have any Niners players fooling around, diving on people, knocking the ball around, which if you've ever watched an end-of-game scenario, the defense always does that. And, like, good for them. I mean, they should. They're trying to kick the ball away from the refs. They're trying to take forever to get off the pile. So you've got to have about 8 things go perfect to get that snap off. And it's just not realistic. Like, Dak and everybody else after the game, they were like, we've practiced this time and time again. I'm like, yeah, in practice, when everybody knows what you're trying to do and the opponent isn't trying to do everything in its power to keep you from doing it, and you've even got your own staff acting as the referees who are, like, cooperating and not clueless refs who don't know what your game plan is. Like, there's so many variables that aren't in your control. I just don't think it's a realistic thing to try to do. But I don't think Kellen Moore's an idiot. Like I said, like I see the logic. I think you would have been better off going with something else.
I got to say this. I said this earlier in the show, David. I was impressed that the umpire was able to book it to where the ball was spotted as quickly as he was, but that's also asking a non-professional athlete a lot of speed.
That's what I'm saying. It's like, well, yeah, like if the ref had done his damn job and be faster, they could have done it. I'm like, you knew going in that the ref was 55. Like, you knew this. You're not, like, a wide receiver's not going to spot the ball for you. And so that's stuff that you've got to consider when you decide to run a quarterback draw with 14 seconds to play and no timeouts. Like, you can do it if everything goes perfect, but what are the odds that that's going to happen in a playoff football game on national TV?
All right, I need to ask you this. Was the running game stale at the end of the year because the offensive line had those ins and outs and Tyron Smith's not quite the same? Or was it because Zeke, and I mean, the guy at the end of the game, he had played with a partially torn PCL, which is hard to do. Is it that? Is it a running back out of time? Because I still saw him run tough whenever he possibly could, or was it the offensive line?
I mean, I think the world of Zeke's spirit, and, you know, the guy never makes excuses. I mean, he might be disappointing relative to his contract, but he played through that injury. You could sit out for a few games. You could try to rest your knee. Maybe you worry about your public perception, but he went out there every week. So, I mean, I say all of that to say I respect the hell out of Zeke Elliott, but for me, it's always more about your offensive line. And honestly, their opponent is a perfect example of that. Like, Kyle Shanahan's just like his dad when he was in Denver. It does, like, they could roll any running back out there and he's gonna have a 1,000-yard season. Like, the Niners are running all over everybody with a 6th-round rookie out of ULL and a wide receiver, which, I mean, Deebo Samuel's great, but you can't tell me that that's all about the guys toting the rock and not about the scheme and the line. And it's not a coincidence. Alex Mack is like one of the best centers of the last decade. Trent Williams is arguably the best left tackle in football. I just think that stuff matters a lot more in most cases than who's carrying the football.
Well, Elijah Mitchell's what, a 6th-round pick?
Man,
so
he runs.
Yeah.
Don't
get me wrong. He's a great player, but again, Shanahan's been there since 2017, I think, and they've had about 9 different running backs, and all of them have been pretty effective at one point or another.
Yeah, I agree. And the thing about it is, I knew about Mitchell, but then he really burst on the scene when they beat the Rams because, he had been running pretty well most of the year, but man, does he run hard and doesn't take much time to get there as well. were you surprised how well Jimmy Garoppolo, despite the hiccup, which almost ruined everything for San Francisco on the throw to Anthony Brown that he picked up? Were you surprised he played as efficiently as he did?
I was stunned in the first half because I just remember they kept converting third, not just third down, but like third and long. Like they were converting 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9, 3rd and 11. And I just remember thinking like, well, damn, like if this is the Jimmy G that showed up, then it just might not be your day. But I had to laugh. I think yesterday was the perfect encapsulation of Jimmy Garoppolo.
Yeah.
Like he's good enough. He got him to a Super Bowl. He's good enough to do that for you. But basically the entire way he played the second half, I was like, oh yeah, this is why the Niners spent the top 5 pick on a quarterback. So that's, it's a roller coaster, but if he plays like the guy from the first half, they've got as good a shot as anybody to go all the way. It's just, can you trust him to put 60 minutes together against a good team?
Anything else, guys? All right. Nope. David, thank you so much. Appreciate you as always. David Hellman, DallasCowboys.com. Thank you, man. I loved how David opened up the segment. I didn't know how he would open it up. But anyone, and Paul, great question about what 14 mattered the most, the 14 seconds played, 14 penalties. I'll say this. I'm not a Cowboys fan. I thought they were going to come back and win the game. Paul and I, we trade that, our text messages. If we ever put it up, it'd be crazy. You called it very early. You just have that knack. But they led the league in penalties. I remember when they lost the game to the Raiders, and there were some things that you kind of looked at. But my God, have they become the whiniest bunch of little shits when it comes to like complaining about the officials?
Oh, it's
the fan
ridiculous.
base. And then I got Armstrong. I want to play the Dak. Go ahead, Paul. But they have just become the whiniest little.
Okay.
Stop.
Okay, the officials in the Raiders game had a couple calls in spots that were you're like, okay, you can maybe be better than that. The point is, though, if you don't dare officials to make calls constantly, Connor Williams, they won't call them. Because if you're committing a lot of penalties, then they're like, they're looking for it. So
49ers led like the league in defensive pass interference, not one, I think, yesterday, because they never challenged them to do that. They never forced them into that situation.
Yeah, so it's all about how you approach things, and you play how you practice. And I think of all the things you want to put on Mike McCarthy, if you're in the – look, I don't think the Cowboys are going to fire Mike McCarthy. I don't know if they should fire Mike McCarthy. I'm not even going to get into it because I don't think they are.
Right.
So it's kind of a pointless thought exercise until it gets to that point. We sat through a long time with Jason Garrett. Jerry's not a quick trigger finger guy anymore unless you just completely hit the wall with this team. But that is one thing he is going to have to work on is the penalties on the team. And I'll talk about it in the top 5 a little bit more, but the penalties on the team were the reason that they lost 3 games.
But guess who became one who complained about the officials a lot? Mike McCarthy. So he's kind of almost, you guys go ahead. No, let's complain about the officials. He did it yesterday. He did it after the Raiders. He did it. And I don't, it's a bad look in my opinion.
The Cowboys also never get a holding penalty on a 2-yard gain. So you have those penalties where you get the holding. Yeah. They never get a holding penalty.
The Arizona game was like,
the Arizona game, Zeke has the best run he's had in 2 months. And, the only reason he did is because Connor Williams yanked a guy down by his shoulder pads.
How about Randy Gregory truly jumping on the back of an offensive lineman that was 5 yards away from the play, but it was a terrible thing to do.
Yeah.
It was stupid.
Yeah, they got to be better.
Neville Gallimore, I want to give him credit. He had the hands to the face, and I think that happens a lot more, and that was a call, and it was a right call. And then he went on Twitter last night, I don't know if you saw this, and said, hey, I deserve all the hate. Come at me. I accept that but he said, let's leave it at me and not include the family. So that was kind of, now speaking of which, and I like Dak Prescott a ton. Here is Dak, it's like 45 seconds after the game is over, and he's discussing the water bottles being thrown by the fans in the stands, what apparently initially you thought was at Cowboys players. I want to get to 2 points after he finishes when it's followed up that it wasn't at the players but at the officials.
They're aiming at the referees. They were referees. Credit to them then. That's not they weren't doing anything. Oh, credit to them.
All right. Okay. That was a good job, Armstrong, on just the end of it. Credit to them. Dak, you're better than that. You're better than that. And all the fanboys in the background. And Paul, I haven't been to many Cowboy games lately, and a lot of it because of the last couple of years, but I just have, but the laughter and chat, I get sometimes there are answers and responses. Stop.
It was well timed as far as humor goes, as far as trying to cut tension in a room. And there is nothing. I told a friend of mine yesterday who texted me, he's like, Are you at the game right now? And this is, I told everybody who texted me, like, hey, the Cowboys aren't winning this game. I told you from the first play on, they're not winning this game.
You told me when Randy Gregory jumped off sides on the first
I knew
play.
it then. They start off like they've got to start off. Everything's got to go right. But it's really hard covering a playoff loss. I've been in there after several playoff losses, and it's really hard because nobody wants to talk. So one part of me was like, oh, at least Dak is being candid and loose. But I agree with you. Like, look, criticizing the officials at this point does you no good. So what you're saying is they made a bad call. What about the 13 others?
Yeah, because I will say this. I don't like overly officiated games. It drives me nuts. I can't stand it. And I think the NFL has become way too overly sensitive with everything. But it's a bad look. It's a bad look. And especially when you lead the league, there's a reason for that. That means you do it week in and almost week out. All right, when we come